Okay, thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. We're going to start with the second session, Pakistan Strategic Outlook. We've got a fabulous panel. Steve Cole challenged us to think about some of the deeper currents that are changing the scene in South Asia, not just the typical stuff about national security matters. And I think that despite all the doom and gloom about Pakistan that we often hear in Washington, there are some sort of, I think, very important trends that actually are really operating in the favor of Pakistan's long-term prospects. First of all, really an independent media that, of course, is freighted with a lot of problems sometimes because independent media is independent and can say all sorts of things, and there's too many conspiracy theories in the Pakistani press. However, if you go back about 10 years in Pakistan, you visited Pakistan in the 80s, as I started doing, there was basically one channel, PTV, which was government propaganda. Now there are something like 30 news channels. A lot of them are pro-democracy, anti-Taliban, played a role in essentially Musharraf's demise and played a very important role in persuading the Pakistani public, government and military that the Taliban were not a bunch of religious Robin Hoods as they were seen even a few years ago, but essentially a bunch of thugs. And if you look at public opinion polling in Pakistan, support for suicide bombings dropped from 33% to 5% in the last several years. Support for the Taliban is cratering. Support for bin Laden personally has dropped precipitously. So these are big changes. And in the 2008 election, as you know, the pro-Taliban religious parties, known as the MMA, dropped from 11% of the vote that they got in 2002, which allowed them to control 2 of Pakistan's 4 provinces, to 2% of the vote. So essentially they were annihilated at the polls. And so most Pakistanis do not embrace these religious parties, the Taliban, or their ideas. Quite the opposite. Also, another I think quite important change is the lawyers' movement, which came out of nowhere, essentially got rid of Musharraf. It did not come out of the political party system, demonstrating that civil society is alive and well in Pakistan. So these are some sort of major trends that I think are not necessarily predictable trends that are operating, suggesting that Pakistan could be on the right path. Now, of course, we have the floods, which is an enormous black swan. Pakistan has always been a pre-revolutionary state. In many senses, its political elites have served it very poorly as a general proposition. Pakistan has had few great leaders. It's unfortunate that Jinnah, of course, died so quickly after the founding of the Pakistani state. Pakistan has never resolved an essential question: is this country for Muslims, or is this an ideologically Islamic state? And that tension continues to bedevil the country. But the floods provide, I think, perhaps black swans are not necessarily negative. They can actually produce positive effects. The floods are a huge black swan. If the Pakistani elite is seen by the Pakistani population to have not risen to the occasion, that could produce some much-needed change in Pakistan. So with those opening observations, I wanted to introduce our 4 panelists. It's very hard to think of a more accomplished group. We're first going to hear from Inspector General Naveed Khan, who commanded 80,000 police officers in the Northwest Frontier Province, was one of the leaders of the fight against the Taliban in the Northwest Frontier Province. His brother, himself a police officer, was assassinated by the Taliban. Too often we forget in this country that Pakistan, we keep saying Pakistan should do more. Well, the more Pakistani soldiers have died fighting the Taliban than American and NATO soldiers combined in Afghanistan. And that is something we should kind of keep in mind. Pakistan, the enemy of the perfect, is not the reasonably okay. And what we're seeing in Pakistan is, I think, perhaps even more than reasonably okay. There's military operations in southern Waziristan and Swat, which Shuja Nawaz will no doubt talk about, were done with some skill and also with the support of a lot of the Pakistani people. We also have Bruce Riedel. Introducing Bruce Riedel in this kind of context is like introducing President Obama to a room of Chicago Democrats. He doesn't need very much introduction. But Bruce has a new book about the U.S. Pakistani relationship. It's called Deadly Embrace. I'm reading a manuscript. It's absolutely first class and will be published on December 23rd. We also have Shuja Nawaz to Bruce's left. Shuja's book, Cross Swords, is, I think the word magisterial is the word that leaps to mind. Anybody who writes about the Pakistani military and the Pakistani state in general has to, Shuja's book is just going to be the kind of masterclass on that issue. for a very long time. And finally, we have Jeffrey Lewis, our colleague at New America, who's just produced a paper on Pakistan's nuclear program, who is also now going to Monterey to run its East Asia non-proliferation program. And Jeffrey is one of the world's leading experts on nuclear proliferation and is going to talk about Pakistan's nuclear program. So with that, we're going to hear from Inspector General Naveed Khan right now.
Could you have the lights slightly dim now? Thank you. These ones, please. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. He who commits the murder of one person commits the murder of the entire humanity. This is in the Quran. A presentation on the law and order. Just to give you briefly, and before I start, I must thank the organizers of the New America Foundation, in particular Steve Cole and Mr. Peter Burgeons, for having invited me to this very, very important event. And I hope my presentation does contribute to the overall inputs in this conference. This is the Durand line dividing the Afghanistan and Pakistan. In 1893, the British Indian government signed the famous Durand Line Agreement with the Afghans, thus settling the international boundary between Afghanistan and British India. These are the tribal areas stretching from Bajaur right down to South Waziristan, and you can see Paktia, Ningrahar and Kunar provinces just joining across our tribal areas. The red lines show those areas which were for quite some time not accessible, but during the Musharraf's time, and especially during these operations, now all these areas are accessible, and there is army movement, though the administration there is not fully functional. We have 7 agencies, and I'll just give you a slight this is the Pashtunwali Code, which has a lot to do with the character of the people and the ensuing conflict in this area. And some of the most important elements of this Pashtunwali Code is hospitality to any guest, may even he be an enemy, take revenge for any slight, and grant asylum to anyone who seeks it, even the man be a mortal enemy. The Pashtun of the hills tribesmen religiously adhere to the Pashtunwali, the Pashtun code, or simply Pashto or Pakhto, and therefore Pashto to him is not just a language, it is a way of life. Even in the Jirgas, religion has a very secondary role to play. The tribal traditions are stronger than religious sentiments, and in the Jirgas you do not have a leader and there is no coordinator. All are equal. They sit on the ground and they decide very, very important decisions relating to conflicts and to their own issues. The only time a religious cleric is invited when they fail to come to an agreement, and then they say, okay, let's see what the religion says about this. So he comes in, and that is not binding. So it's more of a cultural values which are stronger even than the religious values of these people. The area comprises of rugged mountains, very little cultivable land, and the plains have little water. There's pine, oak and wild olive forests, extreme weather, and it's food deficient. The Britishers could not actually conquer the tribal areas in the true sense like they did the settled areas of the rest of Pakistan and India. And they used to send administrators as political agents, and they allowed the tribesmen to govern themselves in accordance with their own customs. And it was only when the tribes used to be poised against one another that the British used to intervene, and then even then the Jirgas used to settle these issues. The tribal administration comprised of the political administration, that was the political agent and the staff, but the elders and the maliks who were targeted by the Taliban, and they were decimated literally in hundreds and thousands. Only in Waziristan agency, 890 maliks were targeted and they were killed. So in these elders and maliks, they formed a very, very crucial element of administration. The security apparatus was khasadars, who were very low paid employees of the state, getting about $15-16, and they used to carry their own weapons. The levies are semi-trained, now they are being trained. Then you have the Frontier Corps, which is the paramilitary, and then of course the army, when the Frontier Corps fails to solve the problem. The Frontier Crime Regulation, it's a black law, it's a codified way of Rivaj, the local customs, and it was enforced in 1901, which has the concept of collective and territorial responsibility even in this century. It is a graduate system of response with increasing severity. Initially, when there is an issue, jirga is requisitioned. Individual action in terms of arrests, fines, stoppage of allowances take place. If that doesn't work, then the entire villages or tribes are collectively punished. If that doesn't work, then economic blockades are enforced, and then the military action follows. The FCR is the adoption, codification of tribal customary laws. Pakistan, after 1979, there was a massive influx of Afghan refugees. There were drugs, there were weapons which flowed into the tribal areas. Wealth got into the hands of people who were not elders or who were not maliks, and they corrupted the administration, and thereby people who were not respectable in their own right, and only because of the wealth they collected through smuggling and through drugs, they started becoming members of the jirgas. So they polluted the entire jirga system, and that resulted into this corruption and lack of justice to the already deprived people of the tribal areas. The elite class abandoned Afghanistan, the rise of religious leadership versus tribalism, the impact of Arabs and foreigners, influence of narco trade, weapons, funds inflow. So FATA, the tribal areas, was exposed to new social forces. It is said that whenever Afghanistan has fever, the tribal areas start sneezing. And whenever there is problem in the tribal areas, there is a spillover into the settled areas, because they are so interconnected. We have a porous border of about 1,000 miles with Afghanistan. It is not even charted, and there are no boundary fences, there is no wall, it's not monitored. So it's very difficult. The impact of 9/11 attack, war against terror, October 2001, Pakistan joined the war. The army moved into FATA. There were pluses and minuses. The political administration had failed to control the militants, and the army, when they moved in, it clearly destabilized the already weak administrative structure of the FATA administration. So literally, and then the Taliban's action against the Maliks, that further damaged the entire system. The spillover into the Khyber Pakhtunkhwa districts, and then the commencement of suicide attacks and the improvised explosive devices. This is just to show you the geostrategic location of Pakistan and its importance in its proximity to the Arabian Sea, and its proximity to China, to the Central Asia, to Middle East, to India. Dr. Allama Iqbal's vision. He says Asia is a form cast of water and clay. In that form, the Afghan nation is the heart. If it is chaotic, all Asia... I don't have a phone actually. In that form, the Afghan nation is the heart. If it is chaotic, all Asia is chaotic. If it opens, all Asia opens. If the heart is free, so shall the body be. Else the body is a straw in the path of the wind. Other strategic factors: Pakistan is a new Muslim nuclear state. It has a large professional army. Pakistan-China nexus is a very important factor. India's discomfort with our nuclear capabilities and army, Israel's fears, and Russia and the unipolar world. Now we come to militancy in the Khyber Pakhtunkhwa. It started in the tribal areas, and then it affected almost all the districts. Starting from Swat, it went on to the south, and all the districts except for a couple of districts in the north were spared. But we had, where there was no militancy, there was increase in sectarian violence. So the entire province was engulfed in a very, very serious crisis. The causes of militancy, there was talk about Al-Qaeda. I rate it as a very, very dangerous phenomena. It has grand designs. It was once thinking of setting up the Islamic Emirates of Afghanistan, and at one time the Islamic state of Waziristan. The porous borders and spillover effect of the action after 9/11. The internal factors, of course, the existing administrative and judicial system, not only in the tribal areas but also in the settled areas. We unfortunately have not paid much attention to the dispensation of criminal and civil justice to our people. The Maliki system, tribal norms and traditions were disregarded because of the situation in Afghanistan. There were operational difficulties, there were funding difficulties. Then there was the role of madrasas and their infiltration. Some of the madrasas, of course, were contaminated, and for quite some time there was no clear-cut strategy. There was no collective will on how to deal with these militants. There were constraints of manpower, resources, equipment. The LEAs were not fully, they did not have the capacity. And of course the socio-economic deprivation, lack of education. Just to tell you that in FATA, the literacy rate is 6% among men and 2% amongst females. So it's a very, very low thing. The composition of the militants is Pakistani Taliban, Al-Qaeda operatives, Pakistanis, Afghans, Arabs, Uzbeks, Chechens, the jihadis, the religious zealots and their sympathizers, local groups, gangs, criminals, thugs, smugglers, and of course Afghan Taliban. But here I must say that they are inspired by Al-Qaeda. Al-Qaeda provides them with the technological support. It inspires them, their leadership inspires them, and they also have adopted the suicide techniques from Iraq. We never had this culture of suicide bombings in Pakistan. It all started when from Iraq. It was brought in by Al-Qaeda, and the people in Pakistan were trained by these Al-Qaeda operatives. The militant strategy is to demonize the law enforcement agencies, a belief that national identity is at stake, belief that West wants extermination of our race, foreign culture and values to be viewed with scorn and revulsion. Then they issue religious sanctions like fatwas against the law enforcement agencies, against those people who condemn suicide bombings. The politics of religious and sectarian differences are exploited. The tactics. They start by initially the way how these people infiltrate into communities is that they would come in a group of 8 to 10 people and have a house on rent or get into a mosque and behave like very decent, noble Muslims with beads in their hands, Quran in their hands, and they would start settling disputes amongst people, creating a very good image of themselves. Then gradually they start showing weapons and they start controlling the community through killings, through extortion, through pressure, and their fear is so severe that no one ever dare go and report to the police. And by the time, this happened in Swat, by the time the police would come to know what is happening, it was too late, because they were very heavily armed and the police could not even go to those areas. There had to be a military operation. They targeted schools, barber shops, music shops, NGOs, net cafes. They blasted them with IEDs, challenged the rate of the government, and established a parallel justice system. And this was a very, very severe system. If you remember, there were video footages of a lady being given lashes by a male, and beheading of police constables. And they were shown on videos. They had their own setups, media centers where they used to make these movies. They used to kidnap government servants, kill government servants, hijack government vehicles and use them for themselves. They started attacks with rockets on cantonments. We had more than 20 attacks on Peshawar cantonment, more than 40 attacks on Kohat cantonment, on Nashara cantonment, and so on. The suicide bombing started with more frequency. So there was threat to the security, safety, and economy of the state. As I said earlier, these militants, they create social space for themselves by acting against antisocial elements in the first place. They then try to paralyze the government by cutting the main routes, damaging bridges, electrical installations, telephone exchanges. They eliminate government loyals, destroy state symbols like pickets, schools, basic health units, and initiate action in areas with minimal government control. They establish parallel government adjudication, collection of taxes. Their propaganda techniques are very, very effective. They have developed a very sophisticated art of indoctrination. Qari Hussain, who is a master trainer of suicide bombers, he has claimed to have said that if you give me an infidel, I will not only convert him to Islam, I mean his brand of Islam, in 3 months' time I will also convert him into a suicide bomber. So this is his level of expertise in indoctrination. Then this is the Osama bin Laden's, Al-Qaeda's tunneling techniques. We saw tunnels which were 2 to 3 kilometers long with excellent ventilation system, with stretchers, with surgical instruments, with operation theaters, with generators. So it's not very simple actually. I'll talk about the capacity building later on, but now I'll show you how the police responded. In 2008, we had killed 227 militants in action. In 2009, the number went to 138. In 2010, in 5 months, it is 55. So this shows that the police has bounced back, it has gained confidence, and it has gained the support of the people against this, for which certain measures, interventions we initiated, which I will highlight later on. Now this is very interesting, ladies and gentlemen. This is the number of cases in anti-terrorist laws that we registered. The explosive materials that were seized by the police in kilograms, 122 kilos of explosives in 2007. In 2008, we seized 52,000 kilos, which is enough to make 5,000 or 10,000 suicide jackets, or probably 500 vehicles laden with 1,000 kilos of explosive. And in 2009, the figure was 5,898. And look at these suicide jackets that we've been seizing, 20 every year. The kind of weapons they use: hand grenades, dynamites, detonators, anti-tank mines, rocket launchers, bombs, missiles, mortar missiles, shells. Now the question is, where are these coming from? Who is funding this this operation? Where my constable gets $120, they pay $200 to their militant. How can such a movement be sustained for such a long time? So there is foreign funding involved. The number of police officers we lost, it was 108 in 2007, 167 in 2008, 201 in 2009, and 55 in the first 6 months of this year. So this will show you, and this is, if you see the number of injured, it is literally in thousands. And the injuries are not very simple injuries, because after an IED, either you lose your limbs or your eyes, or they're very bad injuries. So their vegetables lying in their homes become liability for their families. When I took over as the Inspector General, believe me, I thought this is beyond me. It's just not possible. But then we sat together and we developed a three-pronged strategy. First was to sensitize the government and the stakeholders on the severity of the problem. And I gave an interview to Jane Perles of the New York Times, and it was on the front page saying, Inspector General Police, Northwest Frontier Province says, fall of Peshawar imminent. And that really created a stir in Peshawar, and the Chief Minister called me and he said, well, what the hell is going on? I said, sir, you have to bear with me. People are not waking up. They have to wake up. The people have to wake up. The citizens, the MPAs, MNAs. And then I was made to give a presentation to the legislators, senators, MNAs, MPAs. And I showed them deliberately a few documentaries prepared by the Taliban of beheading of our constables, lashing of ladies, and torture of captured soldiers. And very few could see it. They just walked away, and I was asked to stop showing them. Then we went around and formed these committees in different areas, and we used to tell them that if you allow these people inside, you give them space, they will come in, and then you will not be able to get rid of them, and then like SWAT, we will have to take out the entire population and then deal with it effectively, which may not be possible in plains. It was possible in SWAT because it's a mountainous area, the routes are sort of very difficult. But so this sensitization took place, and the second thing we did was to mobilize the people. We set up these peace committees in districts. Special police officers were appointed, but unfortunately at that time the government did not give any funds. So these boys or men did not have even money to pay for their fares coming to the police station, and they did it for some time, but then it sort of didn't work out. The most important thing that we did was then the capacity building of the police, which of course the most important element was its morale. When 60% of the force in SWAT had deserted, when people had refused to join, we bounced back and improved their morale, started their training, set up new elite force, certain other interventions which I'll be giving out. One of the important things that we did was, which has now become a model, was the establishment of a community police force. We started with SWAT, and this I put before a meeting which was headed by General Kiani. And he said, how will you hold SWAT once the army leaves? I said, sir, with this police I cannot hold SWAT. He said, then what options do you have? I said, sir, two options. One is that you give me 2,500 retired police army soldiers, so that they give confidence to our people and they are trained. I cannot train people. It takes me 4 years to train a constable to fight militants. He said, okay. And he requested the government, and that was done. Second, I told him, I said, you have to involve the communities. So we set up a community police force. On contract, we employed 7,500 men of different ages, no restrictions of height or chest or measurements or education. And we concentrated on the areas which were affected most by the militants. What happened was that served in winning the hearts and the minds of the people. The people really were convinced that the government is serious and it is spending a lot of money on this effort. So, one. Secondly, it gave a message to the militants, the Taliban, that you are not welcome and that we are with the government and not with you. And most importantly, they started giving us and the army the critical intelligence. So instead of taking all the adults of a village by the police or by the army and interrogating each one of them, they used to target individuals, and we started sort of getting excellent information from these people. And besides that, of course, since these were affected people, they were getting about $120, $30 from the government, which is a reasonable amount of money for a family. So it created some liquidity in the market also. We found peace committees and lashkars, which I used to personally monitor, and the leaders were chosen by me. And these community police force that we created, one of the tribe's elder I used to appoint as a head of the Lashkar, but it was not a Lashkar in the true sense of the word, because they were government officials responsible to the station house officer, and they would not operate without the police. We gave them our obsolete weapons, which were 7.62 rifles, which were lying with us with 50 cartridges. I asked the army to train them. And I was given a target date, and before the target date, these people were on ground. We opened about 17 centers, we started training them, and they are so good, they're performing their duties. Some people say they're even better than the local police. The other thing was the absence of justice. I had some knowledge about restorative justice system. So although we have it in law, but no one was bothered in the local government ordinance, these local councillors, they would not settle the disputes of the people, only in very, very rare cases. So I, through a police order, created this institution of Musalati committees, which is the dispute resolution committees. And it is such a great success that the Asia Foundation has picked it up and it has started financing it. And the governor has already written to the political government to make it a part of legislation, and the police should be responsible for this, because it is the police which is the most important stakeholder in the resolution of disputes, because ultimately these people land up in the police stations. So this has been a very great success, and it is now operative in the entire province, and we are receiving requests from certain governments to give us a copy of the model so that they can also work on that. On this, and also on the community police, we have been receiving requests. Some requests had also come from Afghanistan. We encourage the people, wherever these people used to help us, I used to give them a quota of 20, 30 constables. I said, we'll recruit people from your community. And that encouraged the communities, and they sort of started fighting the Taliban. And we used to give gallantry awards to for bravery to the civilians, and these used to be given by the governor or the chief minister. So we started encouraging people. We set up an elite police force. It is now 3,000. We set up a project coordination unit for infrastructure development, a directorate of counter-terrorism. We set up a bomb disposal unit, was very small, and so we have in all districts now we have bomb disposal unit. A strategic planning unit has been formed. We have special training. I gave heavy weapons to the force in every police station. We have RPGs. I know it's militarizing the police, but we had no option. And then we set up a directorate of welfare and morale affairs to improve the morale of the force. These are certain morale boosting measures of the force. Out of turn promotions, life and health insurance policies, and we send them for religious tour to Mecca for all those who have had traumas. 36,000 is paid to the family of the people who sacrifice their lives. We give them plots for construction of houses, and we name the police stations after the police martyrs, and the erection of memorial in the names of the martyrs. The way forward is the last slide. The war on terror has to be contained and won, or it will spread in major countries of the world, and I seriously mean this, and it is very, very serious. We should not underestimate Al-Qaeda. Al-Qaeda does not only mean the base, it means cells. And in every country there are cells, some are dormant, some are active. Wherever they want to activate them, they send their people. Their communication system is excellent. They would open an email account, send the email address and the password to the other person, and they would type whatever, save it, and the other man would. So there is no communication actually. So you cannot intercept them. Law enforcement agencies have to be beefed up to a critical level for fighting the insurgency, equipment, modern technology, training, infrastructure development. To avoid militarization of the police force, I have already suggested in writing to the government to form a counter-insurgency and stabilization force comprising of different forces, best people from different forces, and giving them a very effective intelligence network so that it is dedicated to fight insurgency in Pakistan. Alternate dispute resolution forums to be introduced to provide immediate and free relief to justice to the people and to reduce burden on the police, courts and prisons. Build up our LEAs, especially the police forces. Economic development to improve social sector indicators and create job opportunities like the conservation core of USA in the 30s depression. I had talked to Mr. Crocker, the ambassador in Pakistan, 2006, January. He had come to my office. And I suggested this to him, and he told me, have you talked to the president? But then he told the USA director, they came, they discussed it, there was some positive news and then negative, and then sort of everything went good. I had calculated that the tribal areas at that time were in turmoil, that there was a population of 3 million. So out of 3 million, if you have 300,000 over a period of 5 years, so it would represent 1 in 12 of the population, which would mean 1 in 10 or 1 in 12, which would mean that each household comprises of 10 to 12 people. So give them $100, the entire cost would be $700 million per annum, whereas a few missiles fired would cost you that much. And you could put these people to training, give them to the army, give them to the police, send them to the industries where they can be made to work free for the industrialists. But then this exposure, and then when the money goes into the hands of the common people, there's liquidity, there is movement, then they would perforce be try to get rid of the Taliban. So I mean, a sense of ownership will be developed. We must try to bridge the gulf between various religions, communities, particularly in the West. There's a very serious issue about the youth, especially the youth from Muslim countries who are born in the West. They are in a dilemma. Some research needs to be done. It is a very serious issue. They do not know what is right, what is wrong. At home they are taught something else. In schools they are exposed to different forces. They see that there is justice for their own people in the countries, but then when they see the policies in Israel, in Palestine, in Kashmir, in Afghanistan, in Iraq, they are disillusioned. An emergency has to be declared for the prevention of radicalization in all vulnerable areas. Institutions, similarly, a dedicated, well-funded program for rehab and de-radicalization is absolutely critical. The criminal justice system has to be improved. And the last point is, the world economic systems have not been able to deliver effectively. I think there is need for top economists to sit together and see how they can reduce the gap between the haves and the have-nots. These are creating very, very serious issues. Today, the Americans or the West have a very high standard of living. But with this turmoil going on, these will be affected. So it's better to take care of this very serious issue in time. The more we sweat in peace, the less we bleed in war. Thank you very much.
Thank you. If the other panelists could come up. Just want to make sure everybody's phone is turned off because we're getting interference with the speaker, so if you can turn them off, that would be good, particularly if you're near the front. And so we're going to go in order. Bruce Rydell, Shuja Nawaz, and Jeffrey Lewis.
Want us to speak from there, or
Whatever you feel comfortable with, sir.
that doesn't look comfortable?
Okay. It's a little.
First, I want to thank Peter for that very kind introduction. I'll be trying to analyze exactly what it means for several hours to come, but I think it means that somewhere in this room there must be Rahm Emanuel, or at least his equivalent. I also want to thank the Inspector General for a most illuminating briefing, and above all, thank you for your service and for your sacrifice. I was asked to talk about the status of American-Pakistani relations today. In thinking about it, the word that comes to mind is paradox or anomaly. We have today in President Obama and President Zardari two leaders who are committed to the best possible bilateral relationship between Pakistan. We have, particularly in President Obama, who I can speak for more clearly, a leader who understands the pitfalls and the damages done to American-Pakistani relations over the last 60-some years by its roller coaster nature, and who is determined to do something different. Both the government of the United States and the government of Pakistan has tried in the last 2 years to implement policies to try to avoid the damaging distractions we've seen in the past, and to avoid the herky-jerky nature of U.S. Pakistani relations. Many of these policies are in fact working today. Aid levels for Pakistan are at a very significant high. And the mutual relationships between leaders on both sides, if not deep, are at least warm. And yet at the same time, this relationship today is marked by intense frustration on both sides, and by deep uncertainty about the future. This relationship today on both sides features repeated private warnings that dark clouds are on the horizon and that disaster is just a step away. So how is it that we have this paradox of leadership both in Washington and Islamabad that hopes to build a more constant and consistent future for this relationship, and yet both leaders and their most senior aides worry almost every day that the next news cycle could bring an end to it all? Let's start with just a bit of history. I don't want to spend a lot of time on this because I think most of you in this room know the history of U.S. Pakistani relations, but it's important to see something of it, to see this paradox. The relationship between the United States and Pakistan has been a roller coaster. Some compare it to a very, very bad marriage or series of marriages in which we fall in love with each other. During these periods, there's usually a gigantic secret project that bonds us together, whether it's U-2s or the Mujahideen or the war on terrorism. During these periods, aid levels from the United States flow with almost no accountability whatsoever, often into the hands of individuals rather than into building structures. These moments of elation are then followed by deep, ugly divorces in which aid levels are completely cut off. This happened in the 1960s, the 1970s, the 1990s. Each side demonizes the other. There's ugly sanctions. There's efforts to isolate each other. The aid levels, as I said, become extraordinarily volatile. One characteristic also of the relationship over the last 60 years is America's love affair for every man in uniform. We seem to love Pakistani generals far more than the Pakistani people do, and in contrast, we seem to think Pakistani politicians should never be given any real measure of support. The result of this roller coaster and of our affinity for the generals is predictable. Pakistanis do not believe America is a reliable ally. They would be crazy to believe anything else. We have not been a reliable ally of Pakistan. Deep animosity for the United States. Every poll of Pakistanis shows that support for America is in the single digits among Pakistanis. The one I always like the best is the poll that asks Pakistanis, who is your greatest enemy? And America outpolls India. Anytime you outpoll India as the bad guy in Pakistan, you are in a deep, deep hole. This is the reality that President Obama inherited when he came into office in January of 2009. The strategy he sought to put in place can be characterized by two words: constancy and consistency. An end to the roller coaster. We would be constant and we would be consistent. At the top of this strategy would be intense strategic engagement between the United States government and the Pakistani government at all levels, starting at the civilian level at the top, making clear that civil relations should be normal, civil military relations in Pakistan should be normal as possible, but also including strategic engagement at the mil-to-mil level and at the intelligence level. Thus, we've had repeated strategic dialogues now held in Washington and in Islamabad. To back up engagement, the President embarked upon trying to make consistent and constant aid levels. Through the Kerry-Lugar legislation, we tripled economic assistance to Pakistan and committed to doing so for 5 years and a hortatory commitment to 10 years. We increased military assistance and have just signed a new military assistance package. This military assistance includes significant new systems like avionics for F-16s. We embarked also upon building a trilateral U.S. Afghanistan-Pakistan dialogue, a dialogue which began with a very scratchy beginning, but has now moved to becoming somewhat more effective. And the strategy also embarked upon an attempt to reduce Indian-Pakistani tensions, particularly in the wake of the Mumbai incident. This part of the strategy so far has shown the least progress. It'll be interesting to see if anything comes out of the President's trip in New Delhi on this front. For his part, President Zardari has shared almost all of these same goals and objectives and has at least given lip service to them. So has his Prime Minister, and so has his Chief of Army Staff. So if the leadership on both sides understands what needs to be done to prevent a repetition of the past, why is there this paradox? Why are there so many frustrations? The frustrations on the U.S. side flow from the continued connections of the Pakistani establishment, particularly the Inter-Services Intelligence Directorate, to groups like the Quetta-Shura, the Haqqani Network, and Lashkar-e-Taiba. Those connections can be debated as to their extent at any one time, but the history of those connections is such that on the American side, there is great frustration that they are not more permanently severed, particularly when it comes to Lashkar-e-Taiba. Remember, for this president, the Mumbai attack was the first international crisis on his watch after his election. It was no surprise that he would want to start his trip to India by staying at the Taj Hotel. For him, it was a way of acknowledging how his presidency had begun. And the shadow of Mumbai lingers over the U.S. Pakistani relationship today in a very heavy way, reinforced by the question of David Headley, the American citizen of Pakistani origin who carried out the reconnaissance for the attack in Mumbai, and who seems to have been, during his career, one of the most remarkable covert agents in history, working for at least 4 different organizations: Lashkar-e-Taiba, Al-Qaeda, the Inter-Services Intelligence Directorate of the Pakistani Army, and the Drug Enforcement Agency. The biggest question about David Headley is, did he get a pension from all 4 of them? One can laugh at it, but remember, at Mumbai, 6 American citizens were murdered. The revelations of David Headley to his Indian interrogators about the role of the ISI in the Mumbai operation hangs even more heavily over U.S. Pakistani relations. Pakistan, of course, has its frustrations as well. First of all, doubts about American staying power. It's easy to say, we're here for the future, we'll be consistent, we'll be constant. Many American presidents have said that before. The proof is in the pudding, and only time can establish whether you really tend to be consistent and constant. The president's decision in December of last year to lay out the notional date of July 2011 as a turning point in the American commitment in Afghanistan, of course, reinforced Pakistani doubts about American staying power. And all the spin control since then, and all the spin control between now and July 2011, is not going to change those doubts about American consistency. Reinforcing those doubts, of course, is America's tilt towards India. This is nothing new under Obama. It goes back to Bush and to Clinton. But Pakistanis may be eager to tell people they want to de-hyphenate their relationship, and Indians may want to de-hyphenate their relationship. But in the real world, the hyphenation is there, will continue to be there, and for many on both India and Pakistan will be seen as a zero-sum game. We can piously talk that is behind us. It isn't at all. Of course, American drone operations are another source of friction, less between governments and less between the militaries, and even less between the intelligence agencies, but between the public at large. So on both sides, although the relationship today promises constancy and consistency, large aid flows for the foreseeable future, there are deep frustrations and deep uncertainties. And yet, neither side sees any viable alternative to the current policy. Engagement may not be a particularly satisfactory policy, but no one has come up with a really viable alternative. After all, we've tried divorce before, we've tried sanctions before, and that clearly hasn't worked. We can try coercion and force if we like, but the chances of that working are not likely to be very high either. So frustrated and perhaps disillusioned, we have yet to come up with an alternative policy. And we can talk potential alternatives in the question and answer. What this policy badly needs is time. Time to work itself out. Time for the frustrations to erode. Time for the doubts about each other to be resolved simply by the passage of time. And yet this is the most difficult problem the relationship has today. How much time does it really have? Because there are several ticking time bombs or ticking improvised explosive devices sitting in the future of the U.S.-Pakistani relationship. President Obama communicated these to General Kayani during their meeting just a month ago. One is the ticking time bomb of a mass casualty terrorist attack inside the United States, postmarked Pakistan. We've had several just in the last 12 months. The Najibullah Zaza attempt to put human bombs on the New York City metro system, and of course, the Times Square car bomb event. It doesn't have to be 9/11 redux to have a devastating effect on the U.S.-Pakistani relationship. And the other ticking time bomb, of course, is Lashkar-e-Taiba and the prospects for another 26/11 somewhere in India. Either one of these time bombs exploding over the course of the next 2 years, and the U.S.-Pakistani relationship will face a potentially catastrophic moment, made perhaps even more catastrophic by the changes in the new U.S. Congress and the rise of the Republican right, less likely to be sympathetic to explanations about Pakistan's difficult situations. What this administration is trying to do now is lay down some red lines on Pakistani behavior, particularly regarding these two time bombs. It is far from clear at this point, however, whether that will succeed. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Peter, and thank you to the New America Foundation for inviting me. I know that this is an extremely well-informed audience, so I'm not going to go into a lot of detail of history or fact. Try and look at the strategic issues arising out of Pakistan's geography, and particularly the role of the military. My friend Aisha Jalal referred to Pakistan as Paranoidistan, and I think it's a pretty apt label when you see how external threats to Pakistan have fed the internal insurgencies and the internal threats over time. And when you combine that with a dysfunctional polity, then you suddenly realize why the main focus of attention when you look at the future of Pakistan in the region and for the world, you start looking at the Pakistan military, which remains the single largest organized and disciplined force, and some would even say political force in the country, and which is changing at the same time in many subtle ways. And for those from the outside as well as those on the inside that can affect that behavior, it may behoove us to try and strengthen the positive elements of that change rather than feed the old negative elements that Bruce was referring to. So what has been the role of Pakistan's military in the country? Very briefly, the military or quasi-military rulers have run the country for more than half the 63 years of the country's existence. There are three broad areas of policy in which the military has, particularly since the early 1980s, taken on a very major role, if not the commanding role. And the first is any relations with India, and this also focuses on the issue of Kashmir. The second is any policy dealing with the nuclear issue, which is in the direct control of the military, although the Prime Minister is the titular head of the Nuclear Command Authority. And finally, on Pakistan, in which it's very critical to see what has been, since the 1980s, a very narrow view of Afghanistan as mainly the Pashtun element in Afghanistan, which tends to exclude everybody else in Afghanistan. But very interestingly, based on some recent conversations with military officials, there now appears to be some kind of a shift emerging, and this may be one of those positive trends that I think we ought to be concentrating on, which is to recognize the fact that Afghanistan, has been a country much longer than Pakistan, and therefore shouldn't be treated by Pakistan as some kind of a junior partner or a younger brother, which it is not. And secondly, that we made a mistake in the 1980s of basically focusing only on the contiguous Pashtun areas, and therefore the groups that were from the Pashtun population of Afghanistan in supporting the Mujahideen at that time, and completely ignored the non-Pashtuns. Now there seems to be a realization that perhaps Pakistan ought to be reaching out to the members of the Northern Alliance and to the Shia community on the western borders of Afghanistan. Now let's look at some of the recent history of the military within Pakistan, and looking particularly at the public opinion. And the Inspector General talked about this, and it's quite interesting that traditionally the army in Pakistan has been very highly regarded by the population. But it was in 2008 when, or 2007, beginning 2007, that there were very strong rumors inside the Pakistani population that the reason why the Taliban were encroaching into the northwest frontier province and moving into Swat and Malakand was because they were in cahoots with the military. And so there were all these stories swirling around about how the military was just standing around and watching the Taliban do their business, and that this was an attempt to try and undermine the civil administration, and then particularly after the election of the civilian government, that the Taliban were given the run of the place. As a result of this, the army's popularity dropped from its traditional number one place at about 93% approval rating by the population to third place. And worst of all, it was behind journalists and lawyers, which really shook the military establishment. But more than that, it was the strategic positioning and, to my mind, a miscalculation on the part of the Taliban, that by doing some of the things that the Inspector General talked about, the horrific crimes and the attacks on women and so on, that they actually created such a backlash from the population that the public basically implored the military to act. And when the military acted, this time it acted in full force. So instead of sending in one division into Swat, it sent in something like 54,000 men, ostensibly two divisions dividing North and South Swat, but in fact each one of the divisions was enhanced with additional brigades taken from the eastern border with India. So when you put 54,000 people in there, there's no way that a disorganized force will be able to withstand that much kinetic activity. And as a result, with the support of the population, the military regained its number one position. Now, an interesting shift occurred after General Kiani took over from General Musharraf as the army chief. First of all, he immediately went to Fatah, where the insurgency was raging. Interestingly, General Musharraf never once went into the fighting areas when he was president and chief of army staff. He talks about the fact that he's a soldier and he remains a soldier, but as a commander, for a commander not to go out into the front lines when the soldiers are fighting and dying, it seemed that there was just too much preoccupation with political issues, particularly in the last couple of years of his regime. Kiani's approach also, even while General Musharraf was president, was to try and push away from the political. And so he issued orders that no military officer would meet anyone in politics, and then defined politics as including President Musharraf, who remained the chief of army staff. So nobody could meet Musharraf from within the army unless they'd got Kiani's permission. This effectively distanced the military from Musharraf and created the grounds for him eventually to be removed under political pressure, because the army didn't stand up and come to his assistance. Now, does this mean that the army has actually moved away from politics? No, because what I said at the very beginning, it is still the only really disciplined force in the country, and it does have a political sway by the things that it does and the things that it doesn't do. And people that read the political tea leaves in Pakistan are constantly trying to find out, particularly knowing that they have an inscrutable army chief who rarely says anything in public. And so the favorite parlor game in Pakistan is, what is General Kiani thinking? But you really have to see what his actions are to determine what his thought process is. One thing that hasn't changed, of course, is that the penetration of the civil administration that General Musharraf had introduced in a very methodical fashion still remains. Although General Kiani had ordered all the military officers who were in civil positions to either resign from the military or to come back, many of them chose to stay. Some did come back or did resign, but many of them chose to stay. And the most important element is in the Defense Ministry, which continues to remain very powerfully staffed by ex-military men. In fact, the current Defense Secretary, General Athar Ali, who had been given a one-year extension last year, has just within the last week been given another one-year extension. So as a result, the ability of the civilian administration to assert its supremacy is being eroded by the civilian administration. By giving an extension to a retired army officer, it is basically harming its own ability to run the military the way it should constitutionally. by also putting in a defense minister who appears to have little interest in defense matters and no experience in defense matters, it is also harming its ability to show the military that it has an interest in these issues and an expertise, and that it deserves to be respected on that score. What the U.S. is wittingly or unwittingly contributing to is something that Bruce referred to, which is that we continue to talk of civil supremacy and the idea of supporting the civilian government, but all the actions of the United States, and this is not just now, but if you superimpose on the U.S. Pakistan roller coaster relationship, the aid flows, you will find that the largest aid flows always go to Pakistan when there is a military government in power. And this is going back to the 50s. So that pattern has not changed, and in fact that particular pattern was continued in the third strategic dialogue that concluded last month in Washington, where the only major thing that emerged was a renewal of a 5-year package for the Pakistan military, which was the wrong signal to send at a time when there were 13 other working groups that were meeting and looking at economic and political issues. The other thing is that the civilian government has not got its act together, and so when the flood hit Pakistan, the government had a disaster response plan, but it hadn't put it into practice. There was no implementation of the many good ideas that the disaster response plan had, either at the federal level or at the provincial level. So as a result, when the flood waters rose, people first turned to the local government, and particularly in Khyber Pakhtunkhwa, and they had taken their phones off the hook. They were refused to even answer their telephones. The first help that arrived was in the shape of the military. And so once again, people saw that the civilians were failing and the military was ready to assist them. And this has kind of created an imbalance in the public perception. Finally, at a higher level, I think it's worth looking at the centers of power in Pakistan. In the 1990s, there was talk of what was called the Troika. There used to be the president, the army chief, and the prime minister. And when two of them got together, the third one was at a disadvantage, which meant that one of the civilians was always courting the military. So the moment you had a 2-to-1 advantage, you were in the driver's seat. Well, today there's a kind of a rickety, but still a 4-legged stool that has emerged. You have a president and the prime minister, and one's not sure exactly where the real power lies, although most would contend that it lies still with the president, who has been shorn of his constitutional authority, but by virtue of being the party head of the People's Party, still controls what happens in government. And then you have the army chief, who continues to be in the same very powerful position that traditionally the army chief occupies. But then you have an emerging third leg of this stool, which is the Supreme Court and the Chief Justice, an activist Chief Justice who's trying to restore the ability of the Supreme Court to pronounce on national issues and to affect the way government is run. And then the media, which Peter mentioned in his opening comments, still very much on a learning curve, may not be 100% professional, sometimes resorts to blackmail, sometimes resorts, and this is across the board, sometimes is not sure of its exact role, whether it's supposed to be a mirror for society or whether it's supposed to be an actor in trying to upend individual governments at the provincial level or at the center. So I believe this is one of those positive trends that needs to be strengthened, because once these countervailing forces are established, then the role of the military perhaps will diminish in a relative sense, but not in any time soon. Finally, let me look at the internal changes within the military, and I may go a little bit into the weeds, but I think it's important to see what's happening. Number one, General Kiani, as opposed to General Musharraf, has taken a very different approach to personnel appointments inside this, particularly the leadership of the Pakistan military. He has personally interviewed all candidates for promotion to brigadier. and above. And so he wants to make sure that he selects the very best people that are professionals. And in the last 2 years, he's actually, the first year that he was Army Chief was the year of the soldier, the second year was the year of training. So he is committed, and he has admitted this in public and in private, to restoring the professionalism of the Pakistan military. And as a result, he is trying to create a leadership which is highly professional. Most recently, this year in April and then in October, he made his 3-star appointments. These are the corps commanders or the principal staff officers at Army headquarters. And when you look at the CVs of the individuals that he's promoted, you will find the best and the brightest in the Pakistan military. This is not a coterie of sycophants or people that have been promoted out of turn, but these are people that are very highly respected by their peers inside the military. And they're highly trained. In fact, this is probably that last generation that managed to get trained overseas before the sanctions hit in the 80s. In their early periods, and the ones that couldn't come to the U.S. ended up in Germany. And not only were they trained in Germany at the Staff College or at other specialized courses, but they also had attachments to German units for up to as much as a year and a half. So it was amazing when I spent 2 weeks with the forces and the commanders in April this year, when I was studying the counterinsurgency experience of the Pakistan Army, how many German speakers at interpreter level German I met who had been trained there. And so this is the kind of person that General Kiani has now brought in. Most interesting for the future is the fact that the people that were promoted this year are likely to be in the pool from which the next Army Chief will be selected 3 years hence, when General Kiani's term ends after 3 years, but the newly appointed 3 stars that have a 4-year term will still have a year to go. So one of them is likely to be the next chief. That's a guarantee. Very critically, he also accepted training from the United States for the Frontier Corps. And this helped strengthen the Army's own attempts at trying to improve the Frontier Corps. And in doing so, he raised the level of the officer class. And as a result, when recently he promoted General Tariq Khan, who was the Inspector General of the Frontier Corps, he was replaced by Tariq Khan's former deputy, Nadir Zaib, who in many years was the first brigadier to have been promoted to Major General from the FC, who was sent to the 1st Armored Div in Multan, where he did work in aid of the flood relief work. But then the moment Tariq Khan was promoted, Nadir Zaib, who is a Pashtun, was brought back. And so the Frontier Corps is now in very good hands. There's also been a massive shift towards counterinsurgency training, and all the training institutions that I visited have completely changed their curriculum so that they're concentrating on what they call low-intensity conflict. At a broad level, to end this very brief snapshot of the Pakistan military today, the India factor still remains. It's not an India-phobic factor so much as what I found is an awareness of the fact that India has a very large army and that a very large component of the Indian army, according to the Pakistan military, is still arrayed very close to the Pakistan border. And they would be derelict in their duty, they say, if they didn't have adequate preparation on the eastern border. The change towards Afghanistan, much more of a desire, aided very largely, I think, in recent period by the tripartite discussions that General McChrystal initiated with President Karzai, involving the ISI chief and the Army Chief of Pakistan. I think that is another positive trend that needs to be encouraged. And as I said, on the Afghan side, the more there is this close collaboration, the lesser the opportunity for potential conflict or differences with Afghanistan. As for the future, I think political uncertainty still remains in Pakistan. The military influence will continue to be there for the foreseeable future. The army appears not to be ready for a coup. However, any number of endogenous or exogenous shocks could create a kind of situation inside the country where public opinion could shift overwhelmingly away from the civil and back towards the military. And that's something that one has to be careful about. Thank you very much.
So we are scheduled to go to 12:15, is that right? So maybe I'll see if I can do this in 10 minutes and,
Sure.
and leave us a little bit of time. Well, it's very nice to be here. The idea of a nuclear weapon, a Pakistani nuclear weapon falling into the hands of a terrorist is one of these kind of perfect nightmare scenarios that you can have endless conversations and meetings about. But a lot of times that conversation is based on a number of assumptions about what Pakistan's arsenal and security must look like. And I find that frequently those assumptions are just that. They're assumptions. And frequently they're a little bit misleading. And so what I set to do in the paper, which I think has been distributed, is to take a look at Pakistan's nuclear stockpile, a look at the security practices, and try to do that from the ground up and think about the way forward. And I think the place to start this discussion is with the principal assumption that people make about Pakistan's nuclear forces that I think is misleading. We assume that because India is geographically larger, because it's got a lot more people, because it's a lot richer, because it has a stronger army, that India must too have a bigger nuclear arsenal than Pakistan. And that's, as far as I can tell, just not true. There is a nuclear arms race in South Asia, and Pakistan is winning it going away. And that is one of those kind of major conceptual shifts that I think people have to really get their head around. Now, the reason for this is it's not that India couldn't build a very large arsenal, but the Indians just, for whatever reason, choose not to. The Indians have a large stockpile of plutonium, but they don't seem to weaponize it. Whereas Pakistan seems to be steadily expanding the size of its facilities to produce both highly enriched uranium and plutonium. And seems, as far as I can tell, to render all of that fissile material into actual weapons. And so as a consequence, it's very difficult to estimate the size of the Pakistani arsenal. The sort of simple, crude method that most open source folks use is we just simply take the amount of material and we divide it by how much that might go into a bomb. Now that's, as you can imagine, very crude, since there are assumptions embedded in that about the size and operating history of Pakistan's facilities and also the amount of fissile material in a bomb. But in general, I think the consensus view is that the Pakistani stockpile, although you see open source estimates that are sort of in the 60s or the 70s, is probably larger than that. It well could be up over 100 warheads, and it seems set only to get bigger. And that's, I think, sort of the place to start the discussion. Pakistan has a surprisingly large nuclear arsenal, a surprisingly diverse set of facilities to produce fissile material, and so that the task before us in terms of safeguarding or working with Pakistan to safeguard Pakistan's arsenal is really quite a large one. The other thing I did was I wanted to briefly review the history of U.S. security assistance to Pakistan's nuclear weapons program, which is difficult to do, of course, because when accounts of that program show up in the New York Times, they're not really supposed to be there. But one thing one can do is use the kind of public accounts that leak, and if you know something about nuclear weapons and you know something about the institutions that are responsible for conducting these programs, you can get some sense of what's going on. The famous number is that the United States has provided about $100 million in assistance to the Pakistanis. And that, you sometimes hear all kinds of things that could be, but it's actually rather, as far as I can tell, quite boring assistance. Much of it is in the form of equipment, what you might call guns, guards, and gates. So things like equipment to account for fissile material, not tremendously fancy or sexy items. And the other major account is training. And there's a program at Sandia National Laboratories in Albuquerque to train Pakistani security forces. It seems that this is actually a case of training the trainers. I believe the Pakistanis go back to Pakistan and train people there. And there's also some discussion, although it doesn't seem that this has actually been completed, of setting up a similar facility in Pakistan. And that's, I tend to think of that sort of assistance as being a relatively good thing. But it's also worth noting that it's not, it doesn't particularly involve deeply sensitive information. Now, you will sometimes hear discussions that the United States has considered or may be providing Pakistan with something called a permissive action link, which is a security feature for most U.S. nuclear warheads. I think that that's probably almost certainly not true. A lot of the accounts focus on the Pakistanis developing what might be the functional equivalent of a permissive action link. But it's worth taking a moment to discuss, what that actually is. Which is to say, just like people use Xerox or Coke to refer to photocopies or carbonated beverages, I think people tend to use permissive action link, which is a particular system to refer to a broad array of safety and security devices. And it seems pretty clear that the Pakistanis have integrated some safety and security devices, both authorization codes so that under most circumstances a low-level commander couldn't use a nuclear weapon without at least getting a code from slightly higher up the chain of command, and maybe even something called an environmental sensing device, which basically requires the warhead to sense certain conditions like, say, zero gravity, so that it knows that it's been dropped from an airplane instead of, say, off the back of a truck. And, these are important and sensible safeguards, but they're not permissive action links. And there's not any evidence that the Pakistanis have integrated into their warheads, sort of integral to the design, the kinds of safety and security features that are designed not just to prevent someone from using a bomb very quickly without authorization, but are also designed to be tamper-resistant and in extreme cases actually disable the warhead if someone tries to access it. That, as I say, there's sort of no indication of that. There's an interesting question about why it is that the U.S. hasn't provided such information, and you'll hear two explanations, and I want to give you my pitch for which one I think it is. The first explanation you'll hear is that providing that kind of information, particularly since it involves sensitive data about the design of a nuclear warhead, would violate various U.S. non-proliferation laws and laws relating to the control of atomic energy information. It might be true that providing that information would violate those laws, but it's worth noting that motivated U.S. administrations have found ways of getting around them. And I think the famous case that I point out in the paper is with France, where the United States didn't get around to updating its defense cooperation agreement with France until the mid-1980s, but initiated a program of cooperation under something they called 20 Questions in the early 1970s. And so it is probably the case that it would be very hard to share that information with Pakistan, but it's not inconceivable to me that if an administration really wanted to do it, that they couldn't. I would suspect that the much greater restraint on providing that kind of information to Pakistan, and this will get us to our discussion about safety and security, is really about Pakistani comfort levels. Which is to say, if you look at how the United States conducted that exchange with France, that involved putting French designers in a room with their American counterparts, and the French designers explaining the things that they were working on and explaining the design concepts they were pursuing, and providing really pretty detailed information about French nuclear weapons. And it seems far more likely to me that instead of a U.S. administration being too modest, it's probably the Pakistani government, which, with some reason, would be very reluctant to provide that sort of information. So with that sort of overview of the arsenal and what I think the nature of our security assistance to Pakistan's nuclear weapons program is, I suppose I should say a couple of words about whether or not I think the Pakistani arsenal is safe and secure, and what I think that means in terms of policy issues moving forward. The overall argument I would make is that on a day-to-day basis, the Pakistani arsenal is quite secure. It's a relatively detailed system that relies on human beings, much more, I think, than technical constraints. But again, on a day-to-day basis, the Pakistani military seems to be excellent, and there's no reason to think that Pakistanis couldn't do as competent a job in guarding their nuclear weapons as any other country. And particularly given the amount of U.S. assistance, there's certainly no question that Pakistanis are aware of the very best practices for guarding nuclear weapons and could certainly design and implement a perfectly reasonable plan. That's on a day-to-day basis. The scenario I worry about, though, is a situation where Pakistan feels like it needs to place its forces on alert because it's concerned about their survivability. And that's a scenario that all militaries struggle with because it means your normal day-to-day procedures and policies are disrupted. It tends to expose weapons to a slightly greater danger of unauthorized, accidental, or inadvertent use. And particularly in the case of Pakistan, there may be some perverse incentives that push Pakistan in that direction that I think are worth briefly discussing. At a macro level, if the United States is seen as being particularly interested in not simply assisting Pakistan in guarding its stockpile, but being interested in, I think, one anonymous official was quoted as saying, extending our own axis of security into Pakistan's stockpile. That will have, I think, quite a perverse effect, which is to say it would push the Pakistanis to put their weapons on alert much more quickly, either because they thought the United States might do something or because they might think that the location or the security procedures of the weapons have been compromised to the Indians. And so I see that as being really the most fundamental and interesting challenge when it comes to guarding Pakistan's stockpile. There's also, I think, probably also a smaller side case, which is, of course, if the United States comes to be seen as carrying more, being more worried about the survivability of Pakistan's stockpile than the Pakistanis are, that provides some amount of leverage in a relationship. So, what do I think this means going forward for policy? I would suggest three things. The first is I think it's probably time to start thinking about an endgame to security assistance to Pakistan's nuclear weapons program. There comes a point at which you've explained all of the concepts that you can explain. You've provided all the guns, gates, and training to guards that you might. And so you have to think about the point at which the returns from those investments start to get overwhelmed by creating the impression in Pakistan that you're actually interested in finding out the locations of the weapons, or you're actually interested in finding ways to compromise the survivability. And that, I think, eventually becomes a perverse incentive. The second, which is a related argument, is there's a constant kind of chatter in Washington about how we might expand security cooperation programs, particularly now that it seems like we've done all the guns, guards, and gates things that we could possibly do. And so there's been some discussion about removing material from Pakistan. I think that falls into the same trap as the first category, that if you don't respect Pakistani limits on cooperation, you're much more likely to generate this kind of inherent skepticism and fear on the part of the Pakistanis, which in a crisis I think we might really come to regret. And the third is, at some point, if you decide that you've managed as much as you possibly can, or as much as possibly reasonable, the threat of unauthorized, accidental, or inadvertent use, then you really have to start getting at this issue of the nuclear relationship between the Indians and the Pakistanis. And so that, I think, argues pretty fundamentally for shifting the nature of our nuclear dialogue with the Pakistanis away from enhancing security, as sensible as I think that was, particularly over the past decade, and instead to try to address some of the factors that, in fact, drive the Pakistanis to not only have nuclear weapons, but to have a very large number and to have procedures for quickly putting those into the field. So, in a very abbreviated fashion, Peter, thank you.
Brilliant. So those are all excellent presentations, and we're running a little bit late, so we want to keep questions and answers concise. Let me just quick question for you, Inspector General Khan, and also for Bruce, and related to Jeffrey. One of the most creative things you did was to set up a parallel court system in the Northwest Frontier Province that competed with the Taliban's claim to provide justice. Briefly, just explain who adjudicated these disputes. How did you select these people?
Peter, this was purely a police initiative in that we had I framed a security order. We call it a standing order, wherein the superintendents of the police, in charge of the districts, they were asked to select the best people in each police station, 15 to 25, 30 people. And they would be from any walk of life, teachers, professors, doctors, artisans, men of good repute, businessmen, social workers, NGOs, whatever, but totally apolitical. And for this, I had to sort of make a lot of explanations to the government, because I told them, if this forum you politicize, then it will not work. People will try to bring in politics and this will die down. So the government agreed, and then we set up these committees, totally apolitical, and then we had them checked by the Special Branch and the Intelligence Bureau to ensure that no corrupt or a bad person enters these entities. And then the house was open, anyone could raise a finger against a person who was not desirable. And we have, it's a constant process. People are thrown out, people who misbehave, who do not deliver, they are removed, and the fresh ones come in. So a culture of a very transparent, a very effective, and a very decent setup has been created. They just work for free. The people come there initially to the police station. So we give them a choice. We will register the case, but before we register a case, it's a minor complaint, a cycle theft, a brawl, but we give you a chance. You go to the committee. If you're not satisfied, you come back to us and we will register your complaint. They go there, they sit together, and then in the local fashion, there's this restorative justice. Some reparations are made, some apologies are offered, and the matters are patched up. It's not only the new cases that are coming up. We have actually seen a reduction of 30% in the FIRs. Gradually over the years, the number of FIRs, the first information reports, have been increasing. It's the first time in the history of the police in Pakistan that the number of FIRs are being reduced. So you have lesser people going to jail, and lesser people becoming good people turning into criminals by going to jails, because our jail systems are terrible. Then the loss to the communities in terms of hiring lawyers and going to courts, and the delays, and they lose their jobs going to courts. So it's a very, very effective and a very good way of settling disputes. Not only these minor disputes, because mainly they're related to land, they're related to women, they are related to money disputes and brawls, but we do not entertain cases of dacoities and robberies and these cases, no way. It's only personal enmities, small crimes, which comprise the majority of the FIRs.
Great, Inspector. So we just have to.
Okay.
Bruce Riddell and also Jeffrey and Shuja jump in. I mean, the burden of your presentation was one of the more predictable problems that we're going to face is sort of Mumbai too. And how would you sketch out what would happen given certain, obviously, a fair amount of restraint on the Indian government's behalf last time, and how would that affect Pakistan's nuclear program? Because the burden of Jeffrey's paper is essentially it's the alert that will cause them. That's the point at which the weapons could be seized by actors other than the state. How would that play out?
I think your luncheon speaker is probably better poised to answer that question than I would simply put it this way. The Indian government in December of 2001 and in November of 2008 did not choose restraint because of a commitment to Mahatma Gandhi's principles of nonviolence. It chose restraint because of the danger of an escalatory spiral that could end in nuclear Armageddon for South Asia and the world. At some point, the politics of having to respond is going to outweigh concerns about where it's all going. The good news is every day there's a delta between 26/11 and today. The more chance of a Indian government being able to sell restraint one more time. Time does a lot to heal wounds, even on something like this. But the politics of it, I think, become at some point insurmountable for any Indian government. It will have to come up with some response. you can be certain that they are burning the lights every day in South Block, trying to figure out what exactly we could do in the event of a repeat of 26/11, from a naval blockade, probably referred to as a quarantine, to borrow from our 1962 experience of the port of Karachi, to cold start, or to testing a nuclear weapon in order to send a signal that there is going to be some price to be paid. None of those are attractive options. And for very good reasons, Sonia Gandhi and Manmohan Singh have rejected them in the past, just as the BJP rejected them in the past. But you cannot respond over and over again with restraint.
I would second the point that Bruce made, that the escalation ladder between India and Pakistan, particularly the nuclear escalation ladder, is extremely steep. And so I would perhaps shift the focus to a very different approach to creating a situation where you're waging peace rather than thinking of waging war in the subcontinent. And given India's tremendous regional presence now and its need for energy, it needs to see if it can somehow show the kind of strategic altruism that Peter Jones refers to towards its neighbors, and open borders to trade with Pakistan, Afghanistan, and Central Asia, and also with Iran, in such a way that the use of force can become an impossibility.
Well, I think that's precisely the problem, in the sense that if you have another event, you do run the risk of these kind of competing mobilizations, and there are both good military reasons for Pakistan to put the weapons in the field, but there are also excellent political reasons for them to do so. And the thing that distresses me the most is that both sides right now seem to be very confident in their ability to understand and control escalation. And you know, I often think back to the Cuban Missile Crisis, where President Kennedy ordered all U-2 flights to stop, but one still went off and got shot down. And when he was informed of this, he said, well, there's always some son of a bitch who doesn't get the message. It's that fellow that I'm a little bit worried about in a South Asian context.
Joel Rayburn.
Could I ask a question of Bruce Riedel?
Go ahead.
Only if you're from Chicago.
No, I'm not from Chicago. I'm from Guthrie, Oklahoma. But I'll pretend. I'm Joel Rayburn from National Defense University. Bruce, last year in 2009, you led the first strategy review, which ran from January to March. And it seemed to outside observers that the parameters of that discussion narrowed very quickly to a debate between two military options, generally counterinsurgency versus counterterrorism, based on the principal judgment that our interests in Afghanistan centered mainly on Al-Qaeda and not necessarily on broader regional stability or economic integration. And by narrowing the debate in that way, it seems like we didn't discuss the things that have turned into the initiatives we're following this year in 2010, anti-corruption campaign, a political process based on reconciliation reintegration, modern Silk Road initiative, and so on, or consideration of a Bond to regional diplomacy initiative. My question is, how was the debate narrowed at the start of that strategy review to a judgment that our interests resolved around Al-Qaeda and that we should consider military two types of military operations?
You give me an opportunity to begin with a disclaimer, which I probably should have said right up at the front, despite the fact that I was an advisor to this president during his campaign, during the transition, and during the strategic review. I don't speak for Barack Hussein Obama, and nothing that I have said over the course of the last hour should be taken as U.S. government policy. The first strategic review, which we referred to, actually did not turn into a discussion of the two options you discussed. It was a much more broad-ranging discussion. If you go back and read the president's speech of March 2009, the vast bulk of that speech is actually a conversation about Pakistan and what to do about trying to change the roller coaster nature of U.S. Pakistani relations I talked about. The review ended with 20 principal recommendations and 180 sub-recommendations. That said, the question of force levels is always going to be one that the press, the Congress, focus on relentlessly, because it's one thing to send $1.5 billion in economic assistance. It's one thing to send Richard Holbrooke on the world's longest frequent flyer trip of diplomacy, to have strategic reviews and all those things. But what people really want to know about is my son or daughter going to go to Afghanistan? And naturally, a lot of attention focused on that. My own view is that the second strategy review actually only focused on that. Ironically, the administration at the time said we're relooking at everything. But as far as I can tell, and after having finished wading through all 400 pages of Bob Woodward's book, the second strategic review only focused on the question of force posture and force numbers. And that may have been inevitable. Once you'd set the broad strategic picture, the hard question became, how much resources are you seriously going to put into it? And at the end of the day, money is one thing, but lives is something much more significant.
Sure.
I'd like to, I guess, pose this to Shuja Nawaz and Bruce Riedel, and welcome comments from others. I want to ask you about the attitudes of the Pakistani army leadership vis-a-vis India. Much is always made of the enmity with India. American media have picked up. It's a stock phrase in every story. Arch enemy, longtime rival, so forth. And I don't really understand in the current reality in the subcontinent why that narrative persists so strongly. How objectively would it be in India's interest to see Pakistan further destabilized, not to mention collapse? The president felt it necessary to mention this to an Indian audience the other day. It struck me, we understand that we know that the Indian leadership itself understands that a strong, stable Pakistan is in its interest. Its interests are not much more broadly defined. So why is it that the Pakistan army leadership continues to use this narrative in discussing the relationship with India?
I think that there has been a slight shift in that narrative, and it hasn't yet fully emerged, but I hope that it will. First of all, because of a generational shift in the leadership of the Pakistan military. But you can't blame the Pakistanis for this, for internal and external reasons. Internally, since the regime of Zia-ul-Haq, the entire educational system and the curriculum was designed to create this phobia and to use religion for strengthening this phobia about India. I entirely agree with you that it makes no sense for India to destabilize Pakistan, nor for it to take over Pakistan, because the last thing it needs is another 180 million very enraged Muslims inside its territory. But interestingly, again, based on conversations I've had with some of the senior military leadership, a number of them have volunteered to me that if only we could settle matters with India, we would be much better off, which was the first time that somebody in uniform at a high rank had said this to me. Also, the quote in the Woodward book is very interesting, where General Kiani is reported to say that, I am India-centric. Now, I asked him about it, and he's very, very careful about explaining that his focus has to be on India so long as India has this enormous quantum of force sitting on Pakistan's eastern border. If that force were not sitting on Pakistan's eastern border, if it were along the Himalayan border or somewhere else, then there would be less of a concern for any military chief in Pakistan to be prepared with a very large force facing India on the eastern border. So there really has to be a kind of a dialogue between the two countries, and then a move away from thinking purely in military terms to thinking in terms of economic interaction and open borders, which would reduce the chances of conflict. Bruce?
I'm going to wrap it up there because we need to have a little break for lunch. I want to thank our panel. We hope that strategic altruism takes over as a sort of concept throughout South Asia. Thank you.